Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's start at the beginning because I think a lot of people might not know where the convoy originated or how it kind of started. And it's actually an interesting story. So, what can you tell me about that?
There were actually a couple of stories. And one of the things that was interesting is that a lot of people in the country who didn't know each other were really in the same place as one another about being fed up with COVID mandates and restrictions, and all sort of came together. But I've traced the main lineage, if you will, of the convoy back to a woman by the name of Bridget Belton, who was a cross-border trucker, not vaccinated against COVID-19 from Wallaceburg, Ontario. And she had been going back and forth across the border without issue throughout the pandemic because truckers as essential workers were exempt from having to do all of these other restrictions like testing and whatnot. And she was getting fed up and increasingly feeling like a second-class citizen in her own country as an unvaccinated woman. And it was in December, before the trucker mandate was announced, interestingly enough, and she had this terrible experience at the border where she wasn't wearing a mask. She has asthma. She's a survivor of domestic abuse. The idea of just covering her face really doesn't sit well with her. And the border officer threatened her with arrest if she didn't put her mask on. This is a woman who's sitting in her truck alone, going through a border crossing like she has, every week, multiple times a week for years. And the whole situation of her, combined with where she was in the pandemic, really just made her feel like she was done. She was at her wit's end. And, it got very dark for her personally. But she eventually rallied, met up with some other people who were involved in this, like Chris Barber, who was one of the more front and center organizers. And they decided they were going to do something about it. And it started with this very loose idea of what became the Freedom Convoy.
So, one of the things as the convoy evolved and ultimately went to Ottawa, one thing that was interesting that I learned from your book, because this wasn't clear in the media reports that I'd originally seen, was that there wasn't really a clear source of leadership in the convoy. Now, there are a number of characters who all kind of had competing claims of leadership or who stepped in to volunteer in some way and ended up in an organizing role. But it wasn't clear that there was an actual leader of this movement. So what can you tell me about that? Is that the kind of right perception of this movement?
I wouldn't say that there weren't leaders. I think there were leaders, but there wasn't a CEO. There wasn't a president. There wasn't someone who was a leader in the sense of having top-down authority over a hierarchy. And I think the closest you'd find would be Tamara Leach. She ended up being the president of this not-for-profit that was started. But even then, that leadership was over the money and over the bank accounts and over this organization that developed, but it wasn't over the protest as a whole. And I think that's a key distinction, because the media would latch onto the word organizer or leader as though it was meaningful in some very real way. And it was often because they wanted to lambaste the movement by saying, oh, this person's an organizer, and they said this on Twitter once, and that was how it went. But I also think for the people on the ground, the one thing I learned is that who was in charge didn't really matter to them. There was one guy I interviewed, David Paisley, who was not a name that was as well known as some of the others. And he just showed up. He wasn't taking his orders from anyone. He showed up. If he saw that fuel needed to be moved from one place to another, he helped by picking it up and moving it. And he sort of talked to other people that were in that. And he described it in Jordan Peterson's terms as the hierarchy of competence, where you just talk to other people that seem competent and capable. And then eventually, by the end of it, you've realized who's doing stuff and who's not. And they were on the ground, the organizers, because they were the ones doing the work.
Yeah, so it seemed like this truly was more grassroots than a lot of other movements that we've seen across Canada, that there wasn't a hierarchical structure in place. And I really got that from your book, that sense of that from that book. We've got to go to break, but we will be right back.